Hello, this is a paper I'm going to present at the forthcoming Oxford Bahai Studies seminar on Babi-Baha'i expansion and Geo-Cultural Breakthroughs. It's part one of a longer paper. It's from a draft of a paper I published in the Journal of Religious History on Babi-Baha'i expansion and Geo-Cultural Breakthroughs. By the way, I think the concept of geocultural breakthroughs, as used here at least, appears to have been invented by me, and I used it in both my Babi-Baha'i religions, from Messianic Shiism to a world religion from Cambridge, and also mention it in Concise Encyclopedia of the Baha'i Faith. Okay, so this is geocultural breakthroughs. The purpose of the article as a whole is to briefly describe the process of Baha'i expansion with particular regard to the successive cultural and geographical breakthroughs that have marked its development. First, though, let me sketch why the question of geocultural breakthroughs is so important in the study of religions and religious movements. Briefly, I would argue that all religious movements, when they first begin, are limited in the primary social constituency to which they make their appeal. For example, they emerge within a particular social milieu, within a specific society and language group, and address a particular set of religious concerns. Clearly, if a movement is ever going to transcend the social constituency of its birth, its members have to find some way of presenting its message to a wider circle or wider circles of people and gaining their support. This is true whether these circles are defined by social group, by class, language, society, or religious concerns. There is no necessity for movements to make this change. They can remain firmly rooted in the cultural and social milieu of their origin. But to some degree or other, all dynamic religious movements seem to make this transition. Indeed, if they don't, they're eventually liable to become small ethno-religious groups, as with present-day Samaritans and Zoroastrians. They may even disappear altogether. Christianity, for example, first emerged as a small Jewish sect, and only later was able to expand beyond its original Jewish constituency to incorporate Gentiles, initially as a minority within a movement still dominated by Jewish Christians, until the mission to the Gentiles proved so successful that non-Jewish Christians, Greeks, Romans, Armenians, and many others, greatly outnumbered the by now relatively small number of Christians of Jewish descent. In expanding in this way, the early Christians found ways to present their message to new audiences, and in so doing effected a cultural breakthrough which transformed the Christian community, most notably in abandoning the requirement that converts follow Jewish law. So, turning now to the Baha'i faith, here we have a relatively new religion which began in the 1860s, having grown out of the Babi movement, which itself originated in the 1840s. Viewing Babi-Baha'i history as a whole, we can see a series of these cultural breakthroughs which have shaped the overall pattern of expansion, both in social and geographical terms. Three main stages and three worlds of expansion can be identified. First, an initial Islamic stage from the Bab's declaration in 1844 up until about the time of the passing of the Baha'i prophet founder Baha'u'llah in 1892, in which Babism and the early Baha'i movement were largely confined to the environing culture and society of the Islamic Middle East and its cultural extensions. Secondly, an international stage from the accession of Baha'u'llah's eldest son, Abdul Baha, to leadership of the Baha'i cause in 1892 up until about 1953, during which Baha'i missionary expansion succeeded in transcending the religion's Islamic roots, in particular by gaining a small but intensely active Western following. And thirdly, the present global stage from about 1953 onwards, in which the Baha'i faith has begun to assume the characteristics of a small-scale world religion, and larger numbers of adherents have been gained, particularly in some parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, regions of the global south that we might describe as a Baha'i third world, that is outside of both the religion's original Islamic heartland and the West. So the present paper is only concerned with the Islamic phase from 1844 up to about 1892. The initial Islamic phase lasted about 50 years and was itself quite complex and multifaceted. Both the Babis and to a lesser extent their early Baha'i successors were largely confined to a Middle Eastern Islamic milieu, although quite clearly the Baha'is were already developing a vision of their religion which transcended its Islamic roots. To begin with Babism, we may note that although the movement was relatively short-lived, being largely driven underground to a condition of near collapse by the 1850s, that is less than a decade after its origin, and although almost all of the Babis were Persian-speaking Shi'i Muslims, the movement had already achieved a significant cultural breakthrough within its Shi'i milieu, which prepared the way for its subsequent reanimation and later transformation into the Baha'i movement. When Sayyid Ali Muhammad declared his mission to his first disciples in 1844, he was widely understood to be claiming to be the Bab, the gate to the promised hidden Imam, the promised Mahdi of Shi'i Islam. Hence, Western Baha'is commonly refer to him as the Bab. But he was also addressing the specific succession crisis within the pre-existing Shaykhi sect, a distinctive esoteric form of Twelver Shi'ism. Thus, the Bab's first cycle of disciples, the Letters of the Living, were all Shaykhis, and the initial expansion of the Babi movement was largely confined within the existing Shaykhi networks. Indeed, the obvious continuity between the two movements was so close that the Baha'i leader Shoghi Effendi later referred to the early Babis as forming a heterodox and seemingly negligible offshoot of Shaykhism. Perhaps it's interesting for my Baha'i listeners to put that in the context of the quotation from Shoghi Effendi's God Passes By, in which he wrote, "I shall seek to represent and correlate, in however cursory a manner, those momentous happenings which have insensibly, relentlessly, and under the very eyes of successive generations, perverse, indifferent, or hostile, transformed a heterodox and seemingly negligible offshoot of the Shaykhi school of the Isna Ash'ari, that's the Twelver sect of Shia Islam, into a world religion whose unnumbered followers are organically and indissolubly united." Sociologically, an expansion beyond that initial constituency was essential if the Babi movement was ever to become more than a small Shaykhi subsect. Here, the conversions of prominent non-Shaykhi clerics, notably Mullah Muhammad Ali Hojjat Zanjani and Sayyid Yahya Darabi Vahid, marked a crucial turning point, particularly as most of their followers in the towns of Zanjan in the north and Navis in the south also became Babis, making these towns major Babi strongholds and leading to important changes in the nature of the movement. At a popular level, there was also transcendence of the Shaykhi milieu through the Bab's wider appeal in terms of his messianic claims as a perceived Islamic holy man. Despite this expansion beyond the Shaykhi milieu, the Babis remained firmly part of the world of sectarian Shi'ism, however. Whether or not Babism, in its original form, could ever have expanded more widely is unknown. It was all but obliterated as a movement in the armed struggles with government forces in 1848-50 and the subsequent bloody persecutions of 1852. But my own view is that only a significant change of focus would have been able to accomplish such a breakthrough. Indeed, that is exactly what happened under the emergent leadership of Mirza Hussain Ali today generally known by his title, Baha'u'llah, the Glory of God. Later, in the 1860s, Baha'u'llah came to be recognized by most of the Babis as a new divine revelator in succession to the Bab. But we should note that even before this, he was already transforming Babism. Living in Ottoman Iraq, he was one of a small number of leading Babis who had survived what seemed to have been the bloody ending of the movement. It was natural that he was one of those to whom the remaining Babis turned for guidance. Baha'u'llah's response was significantly different from the then prevailing style of Babi utterance, however, introducing ethical and mystical themes that were reminiscent of Sufism, placing the rejection of the Bab by the wider society into a wider pattern of religious history that gave hope to the Babis for the future, and even displaying a familiarity with the Christian tradition that was very rare at that time amongst Iranians from a Muslim background. Moreover, many of his writings presented Babi beliefs in a style which could appeal directly to literate Iranian Muslims and which did not need to be mediated through clerical leaders. Then, in 1866, he introduced a further radical change by claiming to be the promised one foretold by the Bab. Very quickly, a distinctive Baha'i community emerged, to which the majority of the remaining Babis eventually adhered. Although Babi motifs were not abandoned, they were transformed, and the newly developing Baha'i religion exercised a significantly wider appeal, attracting a growing number of non-Babi Shi'i Muslims. One key element in this cultural expansion from the 1870s onwards was Baha'u'llah's presentation of a vision of socio-political reconstruction, including Western ideas of constitutionalism and a vision of a new international world order. At the same time, Baha'u'llah's eldest son and later successor, Abdul-Baha, wrote a proposal for the modernization of Iran, The Secret of Divine Civilization in its Western translation, which was lithographed in Bombay in 1882 and widely circulated within Iran. Baha'i teachers such as Mirza Abul Fazl also developed Baha'i apologetics addressed specifically to the Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians during this period. Correspondingly, when the newly emerging Baha'i faith began to emerge from the 1860s onwards, its target population was much wider than that addressed by the Babis. Most of the new Baha'is were still Iranian Muslims, but they were joined by small numbers of others, Sunni Muslims in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, Jews and Zoroastrians in Iran, and Levantine Christians. We should note, however, that this initial expansion beyond the key constituencies did not include Iranian Christians, whose perceptions of the Baha'i movement were clearly different from those of Iranian Jews and Zoroastrians. Also of note, linkages to Sheikhism, which had once been so evident and strong in the Babi movement, were largely lost. There was also a wider geographical expansion. The Babis had been effectively confined to Iran and Shi'i areas of Ottoman Iraq, but there were Baha'is amongst the Shi'i population of Russian Caucasia, Iranian migrants in Russian Turkestan, and the Muslims and Zoroastrians in India and Burma. Small groups of Iranian Baha'is also established themselves in Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, and Egypt. Significantly, although Baha'u'llah revealed his own law code in his Kitab Aqdas around 1873, most Middle Eastern Baha'is appear to have continued to observe many elements of Islamic law, no doubt largely out of prudential wisdom, so as to avoid antagonizing their Muslim neighbors against the new faith. We may say that whilst the distinctive Baha'i religion had come into being by 1892, the year of Baha'u'llah's passing, the Baha'i faith was still embedded in its environing Islamic and largely Persianate culture. The next phase, the internationalization of the faith proceeded under the leadership of Baha'u'llah's son, Abdul Baha, and I'll talk about that in a future paper. So you're very welcome to support my YouTube channel if you wish. Like, comment and share on the videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. And as always, many thanks to my patrons for their kind support, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. Have a good day.